Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third of Global Cleveland's Global Employer Summit series of 2023. My name is Zachary Nelson, and I am the Program Director for Global Cleveland. I want to thank you all for being here. Today's topic is navigating work visas. So just to review, the Global Employer Series provides resources on how to successfully engage global talent, and that is to fill workforce needs in the region, drive business growth and productivity, and to contribute to the overall economic growth across our region of Northeastern Ohio. I want to remind everyone immediately that our fourth Global Employer Series will be held on Wednesday, September 13th from noon to 1 p.m. and will be about Global Cleveland's Global Entrepreneur in Residence Program, or GEIR, with our very own Supriya Tamang. So if you have not already done so, please register for this free session on our website. I would also like to thank our generous sponsors of today's event, SwageLock, Team Neo, Alpha Micron, Cleveland State University, Clockwork 9, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, Margaret Wong and Associates, and Medical Mutual. We will take questions at the end of today's session. If you have a question, please send it through the question and answer chat function of this webinar. Now, Joe Simperman, the president of Global Cleveland, will be introducing today's host. Thank you, Joe. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Zachary, and thank you to everyone who helped make today happen. Hello, we want to thank each of you for being here today with us. When it comes to internationalization, Northeast Ohio is experiencing a real sea change. We are getting to our immigrant roots again. We are embracing our international heritage. Thank you for being part of this important development. Our host today, Mr. Patrick Espinosa, is one of the movers and shakers of this cultural shift. Himself an immigrant from Colombia, Pat embodies the spirit of Northeast Ohio. He embodies our American dream, and he embodies the mantra of serving others. He started his legal career after graduating from the University of Miami School of Law in 2012. And after spending some years practicing law in Florida and Texas, Patrick moved to Cuyahoga County in 2014. In 2021, Patrick founded the first Hispanic law firm in the state of Ohio's history, Sus Abogados Latinos, where he continues to be the managing partner. Patrick is one of Global Cleveland's most valued, revered, and cherished board members. He has continuously provided legal support, advice, and mentorship, as well as his valuable time to the hundreds of immigrants, refugees, and international newcomers who are making their home here in Northeast Ohio. We are grateful to have him on our board, in our lives, and here in our community. The topic Patrick will be discussing today is navigating work visas. Work visas may seem intimidating at first, but we are here to help simplify things so that you can feel confident in navigating and hiring individuals with international visas. Let's get started. Please welcome the one and only Mr. Patrick Espinosa.
Thank you for that introduction, Joe, Zachary, Global Cleveland, and all the attendees. It's a pleasure to be here today to simplify the process of work visas so you can kind of have an understanding. I'm going to share my screen real quick and we can get started. Okay, as Joe stated, my name is Patrick Espinosa. I'm the managing partner of Sus Abogados Latinos. It's Ohio's first and so far only fully Hispanic and fully bilingual law firm. And we have much experience in immigration, whether that's corporate or deportation defense. And I'm here to make this a little bit easier to understand. So our mission at Global Cleveland is to grow Northeast Ohio's economy by welcoming and connecting international people to opportunities and foster a more inviting community for those seeking a place to call home. So there is a problem, as Joe mentioned, facing Northeast Ohio, and immigrants are kind of filling that role. Now, 80% of companies are experiencing a talent shortage, and 96% of them noted a lack of qualified applicants. And that data comes from Global Cleveland, Team Neo, and some other contractors that that have done some research. Now, what's a little bit disappointing is with a lack or with a talent shortage, there's still kind of a hesitancy of companies looking to hire international talent. And that's probably because they fear either the complexity or the cost. As short as about 5 years ago, one of our old chairs of the board, David Fleshler, told us, kind of a disturbing occurrence that happened at a job fair that he was at. He was walking around the tables, and over 50% of the companies had little placards on the tables saying that they were not taking international students. And that sounds, quite frankly, the bad decision. I don't know why companies would leave talent on the table for maybe procedures they don't understand or procedures that they misinterpret as being difficult or complex. So the lack of talent here, like I said, is 13% higher than the average US average. And we have a plethora of international students. So Ohio is a top 10 state for international students. There are over 35,000 international students in Ohio. So, and this not only is a problem in Ohio, it's a problem all across the nation. Ohio does take in a lot of refugees. However, those are mainly in the more unskilled realm, and I'll explain that later on in this presentation. So the supply and demand gap when it comes to talent, Ohio's number 5 in the nation in the number of Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies, and they need talent, educated talent to fill positions to have growth. Ohio's the 3rd best state in business climate and the 6th best state for opportunities. And immigrants really fill that gap, as Joe mentioned before. 1 in 5 entrepreneurs is an immigrant. The majority of Nobel Prize laureates are here in the U.S., and 44% of Fortune 500 companies are founded by immigrants or their children. So this program is going to focus more on the H-1B process, just because it's the most common process for international students. I'll go over kind of the initial recruitment and selection of international students, go through the old lottery process, which did cause a lot of fears in the past, and then talk about the new lottery process and some issues. I'll go over some of the costs, legal costs and filing costs that companies will face, and then employer responsibilities when they go through the work visa process, which quite frankly is not that much. Most of my clients are actually, kind of glad at how simple it is and how little input they have to give. I'll go over quickly the H-1B process, and then talk about renewals and long-term solutions, which will be the green card process. I'll go over the green card process, the processing times, and then other work visas that companies may take advantage of. So let's get started. So the best place to find international talent are through job fairs at our Northeast Ohio institutions of higher education. You can also call the University and College employment placement offices. You can contact Global Cleveland and Team Neo for those contacts. Our universities are more than happy to work with organizations here in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio to place not only local talent, but also international talent. And there's more than 25 institutions of higher education where, quite frankly, like I mentioned before, companies are just leaving talent on the table, and we don't want that to happen. Ohio is kind of notorious of having a brain drain. We have all our most talented leaving for other cities and other opportunities when they could stay here and make Northeast Ohio a more prosperous place. And being employers, you don't need to be afraid to recruit and interview international talent. Like I'll mention here shortly, a lot of the high costs that were associated with recruiting and retaining international talent in the past are gone. The procedures are very simple, and the lawyers usually handle most of the complex issues behind the processing. So the first step is when students have what's called CPT or OPT. That's curricular practical training while the student is studying before they graduate. The second is optional practical training, which can be while they're studying, but is generally after they graduate. This specific topic was gone over in the Global Employer Summit webinar in February that can be found on Global Cleveland's website, recorded. I don't want to go too much over it since that information is already there. And the students will be responsible for applying for their work permits through their designated school official. The employer doesn't need to do anything as long as the student has their work permit and social security card. The employer has nothing to worry about work eligibility. Like I said, generally, you're going to be looking at OPT, optional practical training, after the student graduates. There's a 12-month eligibility for non-STEM degrees. For STEM degrees, you have an extra 24-month extension, which is a total of 3 years. Now, this is important when thinking about H-1Bs. H-1B is a lottery. In the past, about 44% of the students were chosen. I'll go over some issues with the new electronic system where that percentage went way down. But if you have a student for 3 years, that's 3 chances you can get in the lottery to have them have a more permanent visa or a more lengthy visa, which is the H-1B. You'll hear about the OPT cap gap. Generally, their OPT ends before their H-1B visa period starts. That's also covered. They can work during that time. And generally, the next step is the H-1B lottery. And generally, most employers won't run into this, but there are some visa categories, J visas and M visas, that may not qualify for an H-1B, and that's something that you could ask the attorney. Now, requirements for the H-1B, it's for specialty occupations. It requires a higher education degree, specifically a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or higher. Some international students or some international workers that have many years of experience in a certain industry, though they can also be considered for an H-1B. However, there'll be a couple extra steps. The position must be a specialty. Here in the US, the vast majority go to computer science, business, finance, engineering, statistics, and on the lower end, the health and physical sciences. So the lottery. There are 85,000 H-1B visas given per year. There's 65,000 specifically set for bachelor's degrees and an additional 20,000 visas for master's degrees. There are cap exempt visas, which can be applied for at any time of the year. They're for institutions of higher education and for nonprofits that are either affiliated with institutions of higher education or nonprofit research entity or governmental research entities. Now, the cap exempt tend to be slightly more complex just because of their affiliation with maybe a specific governmental entity or an institution of higher education. It's usually not something to worry about, and I'll take Team Neo as an example. Team Neo just hired their first, did their first H-1B for a student that was on their OPT, and they went through a cap exempt H-1B, and it couldn't have been simpler, and they're very happy with the process. So it's not impossible, it's just a little more complex. So the old H-1B process was frustrating and expensive. Before 2020s, employers would have to physically submit completed petitions on April 1st of every year. Now, petitions are very paper heavy. Generally, they're over 200 pages. I've had some H-1Bs that are over 500 pages. So this had to be done for full legal fees for an entire petition because it is labor intensive to put these petitions together and compile all the necessary evidence for the application to be approved. Now, take for example, maybe a company had 5 or 10 H-1B petitions. I'll go over costs in a second, but generally the legal costs for H-1Bs are between $5,000, $8,000. If they're getting 5 or 10 H-1Bs, they're paying in the realm of $30,000 in legal fees without a guarantee that any one of their petitions will be selected. So this is why a lot of employers in the past kind of stayed away from H-1Bs because it was expensive and there was no guarantee. There was frustration and delayed results. These petitions would be submitted on April 1st, and in most cases, both the employers and the beneficiaries wouldn't hear whether they were selected or not until 3 months later, and by then beneficiaries, if they weren't selected, would have issues of overstaying a visa or trying to leave the country, and employers would have issues with thinking that they were going to retain talent. So the old costs were a lot higher than the new costs. So in 2020, the process went electronic. Registration is quite simple, takes about 30 minutes or less. You open up a portal with USCIS, that's the employer. Most attorneys have their own portals. You kind of match them together, put in the employer information, put in the beneficiary information, and you are given a certain number that will be selected or hopefully select in the lottery. The registration periods from generally March 1st to about the middle of the third week of March. And the selections are made in the last week of March. So if your number is selected, you're given 2 months to send in the petition. If a number of petitions aren't eligible or denied, or the employer doesn't eventually or ultimately send them in, and there's lottery numbers left over, they'll do a second lottery. So this cuts down the cost for employers tremendously. So instead of having to turn in a fully finished petition, all they have to do is a $10 registration fee and usually minimal legal fees in registering. So the one issue that was seen this year with the new H-1Bs was the number of petitions. The number of petitions raised significantly this year as opposed to last year and when the program began in fiscal year 2021. In fiscal year 2021, there were 274,000 applicants for the H-1B process. This year, there were 780,000. It was roughly 12% were selected. Among immigration attorneys, it's a lot of frustration because we would have over 10 applications and none would get selected. And 80% of the H-1Bs went to only 20 employers, which are generally all of our tech companies, looking at Google, Microsoft, Meta, Tesla, are the ones that are taking this all. And the way that this was accomplished was companies were gaming the system. And this report came out from USCIS just last week. There are kind of headhunting firms or shadow firms that are putting in multiple registrations for a specific employee. And if that employee gets selected, they would then just kind of trade them over to one of these tech companies. So although there were 780,000 applicants, that doesn't really tell the true number of people that are applying. So now USCIS is proposing to fix this next year, which will become a lot more fair. And what they're thinking about doing is tying the registration number to passport numbers. That way, people would have an unfair advantage. So that's something to look for in the future and talk to your attorney about going into the next H-1B season. And if you're confused about the 2024 and 2025 numbers, that's where the fiscal year, our fiscal year starts in October 1st of every year, and it's always 1 year ahead. So the costs generally, they're a lot lower than they used to be as far as total cost if you don't get selected. The H-1B registration fee is $10. Filing fee for the application is $460. The American Competitiveness and Workforce Improvement Act fee is $750 if you have less than 25 employees, or $1,500 if you have more than 25 employees. Fraud prevention fee is $500, and premium processing is an optional fee that costs $2,500 if you want the visa to be processed within 15 calendar days. On some more complex H-1Bs, there's credential evaluation fees. This comes about if there are international bachelor's degrees, or if a bachelor's degree doesn't match up very clearly with the job duties. Legal fees, generally for the H-1B registration, is $250 to $500. If you get selected, the full petition generally costs between $5,000 and $8,000, and that can vary with legal firms. So the employer responsibilities, and this is the important part. This is what the person at your company is going to be responsible for, and it really is not that much. Generally, when I speak with HR directors, All I need from them is the job title and the job duties, basic corporate information, address, their employee identification number, marketing materials, and beneficiary pay stubs. That's pretty much it for the information. Most attorneys can find everything else that they need from public sources online. Following giving the correct information, there's the posting of intention to hire foreign workers, which I'll go over in a second, which is very simple, and ultimately signatures before they're sent out. So from the employer standpoint, it's not difficult. There's not much for the employer to do past what you see on the screen right here. So it makes it very easy for employers. They just let the lawyers handle it, and if they have any extra questions, I would just ask. From the beneficiaries, generally we need all their biographical information, name, date of birth, foreign address, all of their personal documents, identity documents, travel documents, education documents, passports, visas, work permits, social security cards, resumes, transcripts, diploma, certifications. 99% of the beneficiaries, they always have this readily available. Usually beneficiaries and international students, they speak among themselves. They know what to have ready to be selected in the H-1B process. So they make it as easy for their employer and the attorneys to provide this information to the government. So it's never been an issue. I found beneficiaries always have it in a nice packet for us to give to the government. So the H-1B process, I'll do this in a nutshell. Obviously, it's a little bit more complex on the back end, but there's 3 general steps. The first is determining the prevailing wage. There are some Department of Labor websites that attorneys will use to match the job description and the job title to and the wage to the Department of Labor standards. So there's roughly 1,016 different job titles in the Department of Labor that not all of them will qualify for an H-1B, but it's the attorney's job on the back end to find which job specifically matches the wage the employer is willing to pay. So employers can also take some solace in knowing that generally what the market average is what the prevailing wages come out at. They don't have to worry about paying twice the amount for an international student, and obviously some of these regulations are in place so employers don't pay international students half of what the market rate is. So the second step is filing the labor condition application. That's through the Department of Labor. That's done online from the lawyer's end. There's some posting requirements. Generally, the employers will have to post 2 copies of their intent to hire a foreign worker in conspicuous places, generally near the bathrooms, the water cooler, or where all the other employment documents are in the physical place where the international students going to work. This is done to reduce fraud and to make sure that companies aren't taking advantage of international workers. The next step is completing the application. There are some nuances to filling out the actual form that USCIS requires, which is called the I-129. That's put together with supplements and evidence. And like I said, it's very paperwork heavy. It's not unusual to have 300 or more pages in these applications, plus copies. And generally, if you don't do premium processing, you file and wait. It takes about 2 to 3 months for these to be processed. And hopefully they get approved. However, sometimes there's what's called a request for evidence. Some officers are very picky at USCIS, and some rubber stamp these applications more than others. They're a very normal occurrence. I would say 40 to 50% of petitions come back with an RFE from things that can be as complex as explaining how the beneficiary's diploma relates to the specific job duties, to as much as forgetting a checkbox or forgetting a signature. And generally they happen with the more complex legal positions and for cap exempt H-1Bs. If it is a complex position and you do get a picky officer, it may lead to a higher legal fee. Generally somewhere in the range of $500 to $1,000 is standard response to an RFE. So H-1B visas last for 3 years. You can renew them 180 days before they expire. You get 1 3-year renewal, and this is important because generally, and I've found in most of the H-1Bs I do for clients, after 3 years, the employer will know if they want to keep the beneficiary long-term. And I've found that it's a very high percentage, I would say 90% or more of our corporate clients want to keep their international workers. So usually 3 years will be enough time to decide whether they want to keep them long-term, which is going through what's called an immigrant visa to get their green card. So generally, like I said, it's 6 years from H-1B, but there can be further extensions past 6 years if the employee is the beneficiary of an immigrant visa, and this sounds confusing, or there are green card quotas specifically from China and India. And I'll go through this in a little more detail in a second. But sometimes the visas are approved, but they're not valid. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years for the quotas to reach to when the visa was approved. And in those cases, the worker will be continued on an H-1B. So that's legal permanent residence through employment. There's a long lead time. The process can take up to 2 years or more, longer if the beneficiary is from India or China. Sometimes, depending on their green card category, it could take up to 5 years for the visa to become valid. Costs are higher, both legal fees, filing fees are about the same. And the biggest risk, which is not common, but common enough for me to mention to employers, once the green card goes through, there's nothing tying the employee to the company. So in essence, the employee could immediately depart for different employment. And like I said, it is a risk, but it's not common. Generally, workers are very loyal and will stay with their current employer, but it's something that employers definitely should know about in making their decisions. So generally it's a 3 to 4 step process. Depends on several things. If the beneficiary is from India, China, Mexico, or if the beneficiary is out of the United States at the time that the visa is approved. The first step is the prevailing wage determination. Usually takes about 6 months. That varies from month to month and year to year. What we do is the attorney takes the job duties and the job title. We put them into an online form and wait for the government to come back and tell us what the prevailing wage should be. The only responsibility is for the employer to give the job duty and job titles. The second step is the most labor intensive. It's called the permanent labor certification. There's a mandatory recruitment period that's up to 6 months. It's labor intensive because the employer, through the attorney, has to advertise his position to as many people as possible through newspaper advertisements, through online job posting, through state workforce agencies. There's at least 5 different methods that the employer is required to post this job, and it's up to the attorneys to take the emails and the applicants and screen them with the employer, decide if they are eligible. If they're eligible, they are required to give an interview. An entire report has to be made. Some professions are very specific and is maybe easier. Some professions are very general, and sometimes there's hundreds of recruits. So this process is very labor intensive, which is what makes the fees go up. But generally, it's the lawyers handling the heaviest lifting in this part. The third step, once the permanent labor certification is approved, is the immigrant visa. It's on a form called the I-140, and premium processing is available on that for $2,500. The fourth step, if the person is, if a visa is not absolutely current, is done when the visa does become current. It's done on a separate form with USCIS. If the person is out of the country, then something called consular processing is done, which is an extra visa form that's done through the Department of State. Generally, it's the attorney and the beneficiary that handles all this. And this fourth step, the beneficiary usually pays this last step. The employer is not required to pay for this step. If the visa is current, the third step, the immigrant visa and the adjustment of status, is usually done in one. So the different green card categories, and I'll go through them quickly. I know we're running out of a little bit of time. EB1 visas, these are for people with extraordinary abilities. We're talking about the top scientists, professors, researchers that have international awards. There's not, not too many people that get these levels, just because it's a very high burden to prove. EB2s are going to be probably the most common with employers. Other professionals with advanced degrees, architects, lawyers, doctors, teachers, engineers, people usually with master's degrees or PhDs. You have to have exceptional abilities in science, arts, or business, and this is where the visa quota comes into play, and I'll explain that here in a second. EB2s are also available to physicians where there's a shortage of physicians, or physicians that are going to work for the Department of Veteran Affairs. EB3 are for skilled and unskilled workers. These are for your bachelor's degrees or less. There are green cards for people that come in that only have high school or less, generally laborers, landscapers, construction workers. So visas are still available for these kinds of workers. So this is the visa bulletin. This is issued by the Department of State and also by USCIS. And if you look at the chart, it's going to have the employment based on the left-hand side. First is the EB1, second EB2, third is EB3. Now you look at the different countries on top, and it will show you what's the date of approval of each specific visa. So if you take, for example, an EB2, the second category visa, and you scroll across to India, it has a what's called a priority date of January 1st, 2011. So what that means is the visas that were approved in January 1st of 2011 are becoming current, and employers or the beneficiaries can now apply for a green card. So for some of these countries, they may stay on an H-1B visa for quite a while until their number comes up, but it's just something to keep in mind on how long the process can take. So there's a couple other H visas that aren't going to be as important, generally because they're more for temporary. There's the H-1B1 visa. This is for professionals coming from Chile or Singapore. There's no lottery. They have a 3 to 6 year stay, and those are non-petition based, which means the process goes to the Department of State. H-1Cs are for nurses in need. H-2A visas are temporary agricultural workers. These are the workers that generally work on farms. They're country specific, but the vast majority comes from Mexico and Central America. They come here on a yearly basis. They come in March and they depart in December. H-2Bs are for non-agricultural workers, is lottery based. The lottery is held in the first couple days of the year. Also country specific, but generally people from Mexico and Central America. We're talking about our landscapers, construction workers, and amusement park workers. Those also are done in 1 year increments. The TN visa, which is behind the H-1B, it's probably the second go-to visa for people here in Cleveland. They're specifically for citizens of Mexico and Canada under NAFTA. The profession list, there's specific professions that can take advantage of these visas. For example, there's accountants, engineers, scientists, all kinds of scientists, chemists, biologists, entomologists, agriculturalists, horticulturalists, pharmacologists, all sorts of doctors, lawyers, architects, technical publication writers, urban planners, economists, social workers, hotel managers, interior designers, ranch managers, graphic designers, land surveyors. There's a long list of professions that qualify for this visa. And the process is pretty simple. The first part of the process is done either at an embassy, a consulate, or at the border. There is a packet of information that is generally done by an attorney. The professional from Mexico or Canada just turns this packet into a Customs and Border Protection official, and they will adjudicate the petition right there. They can be renewed as many times as you want in 3-year extensions. However, there's what's called a dual intent issue. Generally, these kinds of professionals can't jump from a TN visa to a green card. So what we do in these situations is, since they have unlimited extensions, these professionals apply for the H-1B lottery every year, and then from the H-1B, they can go to a green card. There are what are called L visas. They're intercompany transfers. These are for multinational companies. Generally, companies that are not based here, trying to get people to open new offices in the United States. So they're not as common, but there's 2 kinds, one for executive and managerial positions that can stay up to a total of 7 years. And the second kind is people who have specialized knowledge of that specific business. They can stay here up to 5 years. And there's no lottery involved in the L visa. O visas are for individuals of extraordinary ability. The difference between this and an H-1B or the green card is these are temporary, and the duration of stay varies, generally limited to athletes, scientists, educators, business people, also movie stars and singers. So with that, I wanted to conclude, and I kept it a little shorter than I had before. I didn't want to make it too complicated for people that are wanting to get international workers, but it doesn't need to be scary. Just the big points that I wanted to reiterate is that there's not much for the employer to do. Generally, the lawyers will handle it all. The beneficiaries are good for having the information they need. There's very little input other than, telling the attorney what the job duty is, what the title is, and what the wage offered is. Other than signing checks, posting a couple pieces of paper, and back and forth emails, there's really nothing to be scared about. And now that H-1B went to electronic registration, you're not taking the risk of spending tens of thousands of dollars without a guarantee that the worker will get picked. So that's probably the biggest change in the H-1Bs that make it very attractive for companies to take advantage of. And like I said before, most of the employers retain their international workers permanently. For me, it's above 90%. And both employer and beneficiary are happy, and they actively look for more international workers. So, and the more we keep, it leads to better economic and social outcomes here in Northern Ohio. Like I said, we have a brain drain, we have net decrease in population, and these international students, international workers are going to make sure that we maintain our numbers and have a very educated workforce. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was extremely detailed, and this is being recorded, just so everyone knows, this is being recorded for posterity, and thank you so much. I will now open the question and answer chat function, and I will read them in order that they were received. The session ends in 20 minutes, so if we do not get to your question during this session, please send us an email and we will forward it. So the first question in the Q&A chat, Patrick, is, hello, so if my visa is J1 and I don't have any chance to change, do I have any chance to change my visa status, even for a student visa?
So generally speaking, the biggest issue with J1 visas are what's called the 2-year home residency requirement. If certain conditions are met, such as the U.S. government pays for a program for a person on a J1, the student or the program participant has to return to their country for 2 years before they can apply for a visa. If this will be apparent on their on their, I'm sorry, it skipped my mind. Their J visa, it'll say at the bottom, and on their passport foil, it'll say if it's subject to the 2-year home rule requirement. If it's not, then generally, yes, you can apply for the H-1B registration. If there are some other ways, there are some waivers. They're called J waivers. There's several categories of waivers, such as national interest waivers or no objection from the home country waivers that are available if there is a 2-year home residency requirement. So no, if you have a J1 visa and you're not subject to that home residence requirement, you are eligible for the H-1B registration.
Wonderful, thank you. The second question here says, Mr. Espinosa, you say that some companies have gamed the system. How exactly have they bent the rules? And do you think that the government is planning to crack down on this?
Yes, they're cracking down on it as we speak. The report came out last week. Several several publications. I know New York Times, Forbes came out because a lot of people were very angry because it's kind of unprecedented for the numbers to go from, 240,000 to 780,000 in 2 years. So, it's giving some people an unfair advantage. And what we found is that there have been these shadow companies opening up and creating a specific job offer. So as long as there's multiple job offers, it doesn't preclude a student from having multiple entries in the lottery. However, what we're seeing, or what we're thinking happened, because they're still investigating this actively, is that one of these shadow companies that's opened up just for this year, if they get the registration, then that company would be either bought out by one of these tech companies, or that employee would be transferred. So like I said, this is an ongoing investigation. So they're planning on changing this for the next year. And like I said, most likely they want to tie it to individual passport numbers. That way it gets rid of multiple entries.
That's actually, that ties into the very next question, which is, what does tying registration number to the passport number mean, and how would that help?
So, and it's a tricky situation because it's kind of fluid. Like I said, this is just coming out last week. So like I said, it's not illegal for there to be multiple registrations as long as it's a different employer under the regulations. So we're thinking that the regulations are going to be changed. However, in the lottery, a passport number will be chosen instead of their actual registration number. So that way you have the actual number of people in the lottery rather than the number of actual registrations. So, but that does cause problems in itself, because a person can legitimately have 3 job offers from Microsoft, Google, and Meta. And so it's a work in progress. They're trying to figure this out, at high levels of the government, how to make it as fair as it can be.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is it true that the stamping process in the United States is being piloted this year?
Yeah, so this is specifically with, not specifically with Indian, but with the majority of workers from India. In the past, what would be done was called visa revalidation. So they would have to leave the United States, go to visa, make a consular interview, get a new foil in their passport, and come back to the United States. That's if people wanted to travel back and forth between the countries. If they stayed here, there's no issue. But it would just cause problems with travel. So back in the early 2000s, they used to do the passport stamping, the new visa here, and then I don't know why they got rid of it. I'm sure there's some unreasonable decision that was made. But yes, we're still waiting to hear from Department of State how that pilot process is being, so that people can travel internationally back and forth a little bit easier.
Wonderful. The next question is, what reforms to the employment-based green card system would improve the process for both businesses and workers? So if you could choose one single reform, what would that be and why?
So it's pretty unanimous that the reform would be to just increase the numbers on all visas. So the numbers that were put into law were in the update to the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1990. Now you look at the national population in 1990, and off the top of my head, I'm going to say it's somewhere around 260 to 280 million people in 1990, and we fast forward to 2023, where I believe we're sitting at around 100 million more than that. So there's just a lag in visa numbers available. Back then, those numbers may have been reasonable, but our economy is a lot bigger now. So the natural solution would just be to increase those numbers. America's always been a country of immigrants, so I don't know why we'd want to limit that number.
Great. Next question. With the economy being uncertain, are you seeing a decrease of companies sponsoring visas for international workers and students?
Yes and no. Yes and no, and I'm not an economist, so I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on that one. I know that there does seem to be an organic growth in actual numbers of individuals in the registration portal, although the number of registrations didn't reflect the actual number of actual individuals. The number of individuals did grow, which means that there is a demand for international workers. They're still trying to crunch the numbers to see what that actual demand was. So the demand is going up, but individual companies, off the top of my head, I know that Meta, I believe, laid off 1,000, 10,000 workers. I know some tech companies are laying off a ton of employees just to protect themselves in case of recession. But I'd say that general demand has increased steadily, while any fluctuations of decreases in workforce are temporary and specific to employers.
Okay, thank you. Next question, and we have about 4 more questions. On STEM OPT, does applying for H-1B lottery year over year impact your current OPT status? And if your employer is a nonprofit, but not affiliated with an academic or federal research entity, do they qualify for exempt status?
So applying has no impact on your OPT. If you're lucky and you can time it right, you get 3 shots at getting selected. And that's general operating procedure for my clients. Unfortunately, some people don't get picked, and we try to play the numbers by giving them the most chances they have. And those are conversations I have with clients, and hey, there's plan B and plan C. What happens if XYZ doesn't get happen, or this person doesn't get picked? So, but no, it doesn't affect your OPT status. And if the nonprofit is not affiliated, no, it has to be by regulation affiliated with an institution of higher education or a governmental or research agency. And that's where it can get tricky, depending on 1, the officer you get, and 2, how closely, if any, if there's an affiliation. If there's no affiliation, then it gets pretty difficult. So just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean that you're exempt.
Thank you. Next question, of the cost and legal fees, can the beneficiary pay for any of this?
The beneficiary, I'm guessing that person.
That's what it says, but I'm assuming that it is the beneficiary. Are they able to pay for any of the legal costs?
Generally, no. Generally, it's the employer that handles most of the costs. There are, in the green card process and other processes, there are some situations where the beneficiary will pay. Let's say, for example, premium processing. The employer is not required to pay for that. If the beneficiary wants to do that, that's generally okay. But I find that most of my clients, the employer pays for it. They want their person, and for a couple extra $1,000, they think it's fine. But no, for the most part, the employer pays and the beneficiary doesn't. But there are some special situations where the beneficiary, can pay part of the costs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next question. For H-1B labor conditions applications, how can you post requirements when your employer is 100% remote? You mentioned in a canteen or high traffic area. Can this be done on the company Slack channels, for example?
Yes, it can. And I love this question because during COVID, we still had this process going, and it has to be by the regulations. We have to abide by the law, and however we can abide by that law is what we did. So for some people that were 100% remote, they would post the post in their apartment, and we'd take a picture because that was in their place of employment. You can use Slack as well. You can use it on a blast email that everyone will see. So there are different ways that you can post this stuff, but generally for employers, you want to make it as easy as possible, and canteen areas or bathrooms are generally the easiest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question. This is the second to last. We have two. This is one of two left. Is the employer petition green card a lottery also? And can you provide an estimation of how much higher the legal fees are compared to the H-1B process?
Yeah, I can, and I think I probably skipped over a slide there too quickly. It is not a lottery process, but there is the quotas that I was talking about. So there's per country specific and total category specific number of visas that are given out every year. So even though a visa will be approved, it doesn't mean it's valid. It just has to catch up. So every year, its place in line will move closer and closer and closer to being approved. That's why sometimes H-1Bs go longer than 6 years, and in some cases longer than 10 years, which is actually beneficial to the employer that runs the risk of an employee taking off as soon as they get their green card. The cost for green cards generally, and it varies with law firms, but you're looking at between $10,000 and $20,000 in legal fees. Advertising fees, there has to be ads that go into newspapers. Those go between $1,000 and $2,000. So yeah, usually between 10 and 20,000 is where you're looking at.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, is there any news on increasing the H-1B cap anytime soon?
No news on that yet, and I know we all want it. Employers want it, students want it. It'd be great for our economy. Unfortunately, our elected representatives and senators can't seem to come together to raise that number, but although it would be beneficial for all stakeholders, unless there's an amendment or a new immigration law, that's not, unfortunately, we don't see it's going to happen anytime soon. Very, very, very unfortunately.
We'll keep our fingers crossed. Well, thank you for answering all of those questions, Patrick, and thank you so much from the bottom of our heart for this very informative global employer session. I can't thank you enough, and I know that our audience is very thankful as well.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. Thank you to all of those who attended today's session, and I would like to thank our sponsors once more: SwageLock, Team Neo, Alpha Micron, Cleveland State University, Clockwork 9, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, Margaret Wong and Associates, and Medical Mutual. Now, just a reminder, this year's 4th Global Employer Series webinar is scheduled for 12 noon to 1 p.m. on Wednesday, September 13th, 2023, with our very own Supriya Tamang, where we will be covering our GEIR program. Please check out our website for more information at globalcleveland.org. Thank you for strengthening our community by welcoming our world. Any questions that you have or that pop up after we all digest this information, please send to our team and we will get you the answers. Thank you so much for attending, and we will see you at the next session.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you.